Yeah, my name is Bill Tuttle. I'm a retired professor of American Studies and History at the University of Kansas. I'm well known, I think, most of all for a book I wrote called Race Riot, Chicago in the Red Summer of 1919, which was my first book, published in 1970, published again in 1996 in the new edition, and still in print and still selling. It's used in quite a few history courses around the country. In 1968, when I was back in Washington doing research, the followers of Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had organized a project called Resurrection City, the Poor People's Campaign. So while I was doing research on the race riots and such in Omaha, in Washington, all over the country, including one race riot in rural Arkansas, which resulted in the deaths of 200 African Americans, 200 people. So I knew this was an important project. So I contextualized the Chicago race riot within the other happenings in 1919, including, again, the Red Summer of 1919. So when I got back to this project in 1968 and 69, I was doing research again in Chicago and Washington. I also was interviewing people. And I had the opportunity to talk to several people who were in Chicago in 1919. And this was kind of an interesting story because I was interviewing the daughters of Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a well-known civil rights activist, a Black woman in Chicago, and before that in Memphis, a very important figure in the civil rights movement, talking to her daughters. And they said, would I be interested in interviewing a man who was at the scene in 1919 when the Chicago race riot erupted? And I said, absolutely. His name was John Turner Harris. He was a 14-year-old boy at the time. He was with 4 or 5 other boys on a raft that they had built floating in Lake Michigan. They were not good swimmers, but as long as they held onto the raft, they were fine. So they had constructed this raft out of boards that they found. They were floating out in Lake Michigan when a hostile white man started throwing rocks at them, thinking that they were somehow trespassing on a beach that was supposed to be for whites only. One of the rocks hit a man named Eugene, a boy actually, another 14-year-old named Eugene Williams, hit him on the head with a rock. He sank into the water, blood coming up, and he drowned, and he was killed. He was murdered by this man. And when there was a Chicago police officer nearby, the police department was largely Irish American, largely white, and this man refused to arrest the rock thrower. And this is when the riot started on the south side of Chicago, behind the Michael Reese Hospital at 29th Street. The riot went on for several days. 38 people were killed, hundreds were wounded, but again, it was an important part of the Red Summer of 1919. The Race Riot book that I wrote again, that was published in 1970, dealt with a number of different variables. I thought after these interviews that I did, including with John Turner Harris, I also interviewed a man who was the chief red cap at the Illinois Central Railroad Station, who told me gripping and moving stories about the migrants coming from the Deep South to Chicago during the war to work in the stockyards and the steel mills. And again, those interviews were very, very important. Again, back to the Race Riot book, briefly, a lot of it had to do with race relations in the stockyards, but also there was interracial competition for housing, and Blacks who moved into formerly all-white neighborhoods were bombed out in many situations. There were two dozen bombings that occurred in these neighborhoods during World War I. And other hostile actions against Blacks moving into once all-white neighborhoods. Interestingly, politics was also an important cause of the racial violence in 1919. Most African Americans were Republicans at that point. Many other people were Democrats, including Irish Americans. And there was a great deal of hostility generated by politics in Chicago during World War I and later on as well. So housing, politics, labor, and another element was police brutality, which we, of course, have learned a lot about since then but it was a very important part of the backdrop of the Chicago race riot. Most of the police force was white and was very hostile to black people. As I said earlier, I grew up in Detroit, and when I grew up there, the city was becoming all black, but the police department was 85% white. And I had fellow high school graduates who became police officers, one of whom became a killer of black people. He and his partner would go down to after-hours joints in the black neighborhoods of Detroit, station one man out behind the house, one man in front of the house, who would knock on the front door and say, "Police, open up." And as police did enter the house, the black people who were partying at that point ran out the back door, where the man behind the house, fully armed, shot them to death. And this high school friend of mine was very much involved in these killings. He was later indicted for various crimes and eventually ended up in the Jackson State Penitentiary in Michigan. And so again, the issue of racial violence became an important part of my growing up and also an important part later on. Some of you know there was a race riot in 1943 in Detroit. My mother became quite concerned about our safety. My father, again, was overseas serving in the Army. She was living alone with her 3 children, and she was very much afraid of being assaulted by black people. So I knew that this was a concern of hers. We had a flag which we had flown in the house, indicating that my father was in the military and was overseas. She took that down because she didn't want anybody to know that there was not a man in the household. So this was important. And then in 1967, when I came to KU, there was another race riot in Detroit, and I mentioned this earlier, an extremely bloody race riot. So these are some of the thoughts that I have regarding my book, again called Race Riot, Chicago in the Red Summer of 1919.